Hi, and welcome to Far From Home with me, Mabel Nine, your host. We are continuing our conversation with Prasanta Verma about her book, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness. Thank you, Prasanta, and welcome back. Thank you for being a guest again.
Thank you for having me. A joy to be here.
So, in the previous episode, we talked so much about ethnic loneliness and your personal experience of being the only Indian child in your community or growing up as the only Indian person. I think we ended the conversation talking about code switching and cultural competency. Such a rich conversation. So, if any of you watching or listening has not listened to the previous episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen or watch my first episode with Prasanta. Now, let's pick up our conversation by talking about assimilation because it is huge for immigrants. What does that do to the identity of an immigrant? How does it affect their sense of belonging? And you used the term identity theft to describe how assimilation affects our identity. And I found that very useful. And I'm sure that some of our viewers and listeners would also find it helpful.
hmm Yeah, thank you for bringing that term up. So, assimilation essentially means that a person of another culture or ethnic or racial identity is assimilated into mainstream culture. And essentially, it means that they are the ones who end up giving them their own identity behind. They leave their cultural traditions or language or some of their beliefs behind, and they sort of assimilate and they get kind of absorbed into mainstream culture. And so that is very different from what we would call integration, where it's more of a two-way street, where there's more of a give and take, and there's an acceptance and a way of belonging that is not giving up all of ourselves and giving all of our identity and who we are and our beliefs and our background. So when we give up assimilate ourselves and in assimilation, we're essentially giving up a huge chunk of our identity.
Mm,
So for my parents' generation and previous immigrants generations, that's just what you did.
yeah.
That was what people had to do to survive. So that was the choice that they had, and they felt like, surviving was enough, so they had to do that. That's just
Mm,
the way it was. But I think things have changed now, and and we're seeing a shift in people are understanding that there's not just that way, that we
mm,
can belong without fully assimilating and giving up everything about ourselves and making ourselves into a white American, right? Because we obviously aren't all white Americans. And look at the diversity of our society and our world. So to give that up is just to erase a part of ourselves. It's a sense of erasure. And I call it identity theft because, to require that or to say that you must do this to belong, it's like stealing our identity. And I don't mean identity theft in the same way of somebody stealing our social security number
mm,
or our credit cards or our name and that sort of thing. It's a different kind of identity theft when
yeah.
our sense of being and who we are is sort of being taken from us, or we're pressured to give it up. And that's painful because you
Mm,
can't give up. In the book I talk about people who have lost limbs. And when you
mm,
lose a limb, people who have had amputations or have lost limbs, and sometimes they complain of something called a ghost pain. And
mm,
so that limb is gone, but they'll feel pain there. They'll just their brain and their mind believes it's still there and it belongs there, right? And so I think there's a similar kind of feeling in our psyche and our mind and our emotional well-being when we give all of that up, because a part of ourselves is being, cut off or divided because our society or our culture says you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this or that, or you need to be this or that. And so that kind of sense is that when that's cut off, there's some pain. And so that's where that whole concept I came from.
yeah. Thank you for explaining that. I can relate to it so much. And some people hold the opinion that certain cultures can in no way assimilate into American culture, and therefore we shouldn't welcome them as
Mm,
immigrants. I've heard leaders say such things, oh, it's okay, we should be a welcoming nation and we'll welcome immigrants as long as they assimilate into our culture. That's fine. So I don't know what they mean by that, but I think they are holding on to a very rigid view of this is what it means to be American. And if you don't fit in that mold, then you're not, they don't see you as assimilating. So, with what you're saying, I think is very important, especially for those who are non-immigrants, to understand that assimilation takes time. It is a painful process and affects our identity.
mm,
And they also are they are part of the journey in the sense that they can contribute to helping us feeling more like we belong. So
mm,
the responsibility, the burden is not completely on the immigrant, but it is also on the society that they are coming into.
mhm,
How loving or how accepting is that community or that society? Are they creating spaces for immigrants to, get in and be themselves, and yet maybe, appreciate American values and even adopt some of those American values?
mhm.
So I think it's so important that those who are not immigrants from any country, not just America, understand that
Yeah.
they also need to bear a little bit of that burden of helping immigrants integrate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, integration and then asking ourselves or asking themselves, how welcoming is my space? Am I creating or providing a space that is welcoming or not? And just asking that question and being curious about that is an important step.
Yeah, yeah. Now let's just pivot a little bit. I wanted to talk to you about your faith because I know that you were born in a Hindu family, an Indian Hindu family, and you started going to church as a young girl. So when did you come to, accept Jesus, and how did that happen? And talk to us a little bit about your faith journey.
Yeah, sure. So it's very an unconventional story because I grew up like you mentioned, a Hindu family, and because my family, I think because we ended up in such small towns and rural areas away from any Indian community. Indian people are very spiritual people, and they do talk about God and faith and spirituality just in daily talking and life, which I think is a little bit different in the US culture. So my parents actually sought out, the faith communities that were available to them were like churches. And so we actually started going to church when I was very, very young. And, I think my parents thought, hey, there's some good values and things that can be taught here. And it would be good for us to go. And so we would go to church from when I was very young. And so wherever we lived, I remember going. And so in the South, which is, the Bible Belt, there's churches like on every corner pretty much. So we ended up going to a church. And then, I guess I started asking questions about God and about faith. And I think I started asking questions when I was about 10. And so I was wondering if God is real. Does he really listen to us? And I remember asking the friends that went to church that question. And then I think by the time I was 13, it was kind of a process. I had been going for a while, and I started middle school and high school, which was super difficult. And so I guess, that was when I started believing that this is true. I think this is, I feel like this is true for me. And that's when I made a profession of faith in my life. I was about 13 years old. And so that was my journey. And that's when it started. And it just, I guess, continued from there.
Yeah. So much of your beliefs about God and your faith shows up in your book because almost every chapter ends with spiritual encouragement and a story from the Bible. So tell us about how your faith or your relationship with God helped you combat ethnic loneliness.
Mhm. Yeah, it was a journey. On my own personal journey, I had to come to the place where I accepted how God made me.
Mm,
Because for a good portion of my life, I rebelled against it. I fought against God. I argued against God. I asked God, why did he do this? Because because of the ethnic, tension that the ethnic identity, I was wrestling with it. Like, God, if you wanted me to be living in America, why didn't you make me look American?
Mm,
And, I even wanted to be white, which is the case for a number of people of color. And which is really sad, if you think
mm,
about that, it's sad. So I had to go on my own journey of acceptance and getting to a place of joy of believing that what God did was good and what God did was right and it's beautiful and this is a good thing. This is not something to be ashamed of. This is
mhm,
not something that's bad. And just to feel like you're equally loved, you're
mm,
equally delighted in. And it doesn't matter what the outside world might be saying about you.
mhm.
That's not true. That's not true about how God sees you.
Amen. Yeah.
It's not true about what God is doing in the world. So that was a journey that I had to do. I had to be on that journey in my own personal life.
Yeah.
So it helped me to get healing. It helped me to get to
Mm,
the point where, I believed that truth. I had to believe it for myself.
yeah. To have that identity grounded in Christ was important to you as you were dealing with the tension of living in between cultures and assessing others' perceptions of you. You had to believe what God was saying about you.
Mm,
And I found it so beautiful in your book. In certain places, you tell the reader, God sees you, God knows you, He loves you. And for someone who's an ethnic minority and feeling this loneliness deeply, those truths can resonate on a deeper level and give them comfort and strength. And in the later part of your book, you talk about strategies to help with ethnic loneliness. And one of them is sharing stories. You devoted an entire chapter to it, why sharing stories is important. So, can you shed some light on that?
mhm. Yeah, so thank you, Mabel, for those words. And so regarding stories, so I give the example, I share some examples in the book, but so earlier, in our first episode, you talked about Jhumpa Lahiri,
Yeah.
and she was an important part of that for me because when I read her stories and when I read her books, I saw myself.
Mm,
And there was not a lot of literature that I had read that I was exposed to growing up in the US written by Indians or Indian Americans. Now, if I had grown up in India, I would of course read whatever books were available by Indian authors. But even say world literature courses or which I don't know if I ever took a world lit course, but it's what I studied in school was heavily Western. It was Western literature, European literature, just the emphasis was on the West, not
mm,
so much on the East. So what sort of stories and books was I reading that had people who looked like me? Nothing. I mean,
mm,
hardly. I mean, I can't remember if there was anything even. But Jhumpa Lahiri, when I read her book, kind of gave me, her stories opened something in me that sort of, I was always writing, but kind of
mm,
opened up the doors for me in terms of a gift of being a writer. Like she gave me
mm,
the gift of naming myself as a writer. So the powerful thing about stories is that you can see yourself. There's so many things, but one of them is that representation is
mhm.
that you can see yourself in a story.
Yeah.
And that's so important. But also just helping us to have empathy and
Mm,
understand another person and their life and help us to walk in their shoes. That's what a story does.
yeah.
And that can't happen with a fact or a data, or if I tell you, for example, if I tell you by 2045 the majority of the US will be non-white. I mean, that doesn't make you feel anything,
Mhm.
right? But a story can open that for us and help us to understand, oh, that the impact of that is such and such because of a story. And
Mm,
then you can see yourself in that story. You can see yourself and put yourself in a story and understand how that another person might feel or how you might feel and what we might be able to do about it.
yeah, that's beautiful. It breaks down barriers, it breaks down prejudices, any kind of biases, and it
Mhm.
can really shift your thinking about someone or a certain group of people. So that is powerful. And that is what we are actually trying to do here by sharing your story is I hope that someone can, resonate with your story and know that they are not alone in what they're going through, that you've also been there and you know how it feels. And that in itself is powerful. Finding solidarity with someone in your experiences, in your story, even in your history can be a powerful thing. Another benefit I see is that it connects us, right? It just brings us together on and helps us all connect as human beings. Can you talk to us about the role that churches can play in helping ethnic minorities as they go through loneliness and all these tensions?
Mhm.
And in your opinion, have they been doing a good job of it? And if not, what can they do?
Yeah. Well, I think churches can play a vital role. So a church can be that welcoming place. And a church can be taking steps to be intentional about providing a welcoming environment and a space and opportunity to connect with many people together. So they're for sure a vital role that a church can play in having conversations. They can have book studies. Um, from a leadership perspective, church leaders and pastors can set this as a priority and kind of cast that vision for the congregation about what are we going to do about um, immigrants and the populations that are in our community. How are we going to serve them, and how are we going to love them, and what role are we going to play? So there's a vital role that churches can play. Um, so what and the question of, how are they doing? Well, historically, the church was not doing very well,
Mhm.
honestly. When you go back to the history of the church, and I'm not an expert in this, but I read and I referred to this book in the past, Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise, where
Yeah.
he talks about the history of the Black church and the white church. You have to go back and understand all that to know where the church was complicit actually in slavery, in discriminating against people.
Mhm.
So we have to understand that and name that about our churches. And when we can name it and acknowledge it, and then we can then take the next step of working towards changing that. And
Mm.
so I think people are recognizing it now, and they're trying to make changes and trying to address the fact that historically the church didn't do a very good job in the US history. So there's still a lot of work to do, lots of work to do.
Yeah. I wanted you to read one of your poems because every chapter ends with a beautiful poem. So maybe you can read one of those poems to us.
Sure, sure. Okay, so I will read. So this is the poem at the end of the first chapter, chapter 1. And so each poem is titled, So What Are You? So, what are you? You belong in your skin. Your ethnicity, your culture, and your kind is good and wanted and needed. What hurts you, hurts me, hurts us all. On the island of disbelonging, you are rich in love by others who want to love you. The universe opens its arms to you.
Beautiful. There's so much that you've said in just those few words. Love it. I wanted to end our conversation by talking about parenting and what advice would you give to parents like me who are first generation immigrants who are raising kids in this culture. My son was a year old when he came to the US, and there are so many immigrants raising children here. What is your advice to them?
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. First, I would say talk about it, have conversations, open conversations with children about this, about your ethnic identity, your background, your history, your family stories, give them to your children and let them know your heritage and your background as much as possible so that they have that sense of where they come from and who they are. And so give that to them and talk about it and talk about the tensions that they might experience as a result of that. And I would say don't shy from those conversations. Have them openly. Expose your child to your culture, because especially if you're not living in a culture where or in a community where they are exposed, expose them to your culture, but not just your culture, expose them to a variety of different people and cultures and make it normal. Like
Mm,
make it normal to be friends with so many different kinds of ethnic and cultural groups
yeah.
and racial groups. Make it, this is just normal. This is who we are. And so right now we have to talk about it because it's not normal, right? If it were normal, we wouldn't be like talking about it and discussing it and saying we need to do this or that, right? So as parents, you can be that example because not just talk about it, but do it because they're going
Mm.
to catch what we do more than what we say. So those are some things as a parents that you can do.
Thank you. Good words of wisdom and great advice. So thank you, Prasanta, for taking time out to talk to us about your book, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness. And I'm holding up a copy here of her book. This is an advanced reader's copy. Her book comes out on April 16th, and I would encourage you to pre-order a copy right now. If you're an immigrant, you will find so much comfort, strength, and hope from reading this book. And I would highly recommend it to those who are not immigrants because it just gives you a window into what people of color go through, especially immigrants. So thank you for writing this book, Prasanta. And we hope that viewers will participate in the giveaway that we're doing of your book. So if you click on the link that's in the show notes and enter into the giveaway, you can win a copy of a book signed by Prasanta herself. Thanks, Prasanta.
Mabel, thank you so much. It's been a joy and delight to talk with you, my fellow friend from India.
Yeah, bye.